Today's video is sponsored by one of my favorite subscription services, Scribd. Scribd is this fantastic service that has a massive library of audiobooks, ebooks, online magazines, and more. What's great about Scribd, especially compared to Audible, is that you get unlimited downloads and it's less expensive. I even have an audiobook I think you'll really enjoy if you like watching this channel, and that is Under the Banner of Heaven by Jon Krakauer. It's a fascinating book that tells both the story of a brutal double homicide in Utah and the history of Mormonism. To listen to this riveting book, click on the link at the top of the description box just below the video. Of course, if you start listening to it and don't like it, just start listening to another audiobook. That is one of the great aspects of Scribd. So support my channel and sign up for Scribd today. I just want to say a big thanks to Scribd for sponsoring. And now, here's today's video. Number 3. Alice Riley. William Wise was Irish, but in 1733 he was living in England. Wise was in his 50s and he had fallen on hard times. He was so poor that he thought he was going to starve to death. But in September 1733 he managed to get on the ship, the Anne, which was bringing settlers to Savannah, Georgia. The colony of Georgia and the city of Savannah had just been established months earlier in February. On the passage, Wise caused quite a stir. When he boarded the ship, he brought along a teenage girl that he claimed was his daughter. It turned out that the girl wasn't his daughter, it was a 14-year-old sex worker. The Anne made landfall in December 1733. Wise was given an area of land on Hutchinson's Island, which was just across the Savannah River from the main settlement. On the land, Wise was supposed to raise cattle. But not long after arriving, Wise became ill. He was given 2 indentured servants who would help him, Richard White and Alice Riley, who was about 17 years old. White and Riley arrived in early 1734 on a ship from Ireland. By the time they made landfall, they and everyone else on board had nearly died from starvation. One notable aspect about Wise was that he had his own hair and didn't wear a wig. His hair was white and it was long enough to reach his waist. Every morning, Wise had Riley wash him from a pail, and then White would comb his hair. Supposedly, Wise was horribly abusive to Riley and White, and it's believed that he sexually assaulted Riley. On March 1st, 1734, Wise was found dead in his home. There was a handkerchief tied around his neck, tight enough to cut off his oxygen, and his head was submerged in the bucket of water that was used to wash him. White and Riley were gone, and a manhunt was launched. They were arrested a short time later while they were trying to flee to South Carolina. On May 11, 1734, they were both convicted, and they were sentenced to hang. That's when Alice Riley revealed that she was pregnant. Thinking it was barbaric to execute a pregnant woman, the executions of both Riley and White were postponed until the baby was born. 8 months after Riley was convicted, on December 21st, she gave birth to a son, James. No one is sure if White was the father or if the child was a result of Wise sexually assaulting Riley. The baby was adopted by a family in Savannah. Less than a month after giving birth, Riley was brought to Wright Square in Savannah. As she was led to the gallows and the noose was placed around her neck, she swore she was innocent. Her pleas fell on deaf ears, and the 17-year-old was executed. William Wise was the first person murdered in Georgia, and Alice Riley was the first person to be executed. After Riley's execution, White escaped custody, but he was recaptured a short time later. He was hanged on January 21st, 1735, about a month after Riley was executed. Weeks after White's execution, Riley's infant son, James, died as well. Today, Wright Square is a popular tourist spot in Savannah's historic district. Some people claim it is the most haunted spot in Savannah. One ghost people claim to see is the ghost of Alice Riley. Supposedly, her ghost is a teenage girl in tattered clothes. She is often crying and looking for her baby. She supposedly appears most often to pregnant women and mothers with infants and wants to take their babies from them. Number 2. Mamie Thurman. Mamie Morrison was born on September 12, 1900, in the small town of Bradfordville, Kentucky. Her mother died when she was 3, and she was raised by her father. There were rumors that he abused her. In 1920, Mamie married Jack Thurman. 4 years later, Jack and Mamie moved to Logan, West Virginia, which was a mining town that had a population of about 2,500 people. They rented an apartment that was above the garage that belonged to Harry and Louise Robertson. Harry and Louise were prominent members of the town. Harry worked for the National Bank of Logan, and he was the treasurer of the town's library, while Louise was the treasurer of the Logan's Women's Club. Besides renting the apartment to Jack and Mamie, the Robertsons also rented out rooms to 2 other men, Oscar Townsend and Clarence Stevenson. In 1928, 4 years after Jack and Mamie moved to Logan, Mamie's father was shot to death in Ashland, Kentucky. He was dealing in bootleg alcohol, and he got into a gunfight with the police. After Jack and Mamie moved to Logan, Harry Robertson got Jack a job as a policeman. Jack worked the night shift as a patrolman. Harry also arranged a job for Mamie at the bank where he worked. On the evening of January 21st, 1932, Jack left the apartment at 5:30 to go to work. He called Mamie at home later that night, but there was no answer. It was a quiet night on patrol for Jack. The only notable thing that happened was that a storm blew into the area and it rained for several hours. When Jack got home at 6 a.m., Mamie was not there and the bed had not been slept in. Around the same time that Jack got home, a man made his way to the top of Trace Mountain near Holden, West Virginia, which is about 7 miles from Logan. He was close to a road that led from the base of the mountain to the top. The mine was no longer in use, but it was called Mine 22. So the locals called the road 22 Mine Road. The man was on the mountain looking for berries. What he found was the dead body of a woman. Within an hour, the man contacted the police. Later that day, the body was identified as 31-year-old Mamie Thurman. What was clear to the officers who arrived on the scene was that Mamie had died a violent death. Her throat had been slit ear to ear, and she had been shot twice in the head. Both bullets went into the left side of her head and out the other side of her skull. There were gunpowder burns near both entry wounds, indicating she had been shot at point-blank range. Also, she had a black eye and one of her neck bones was broken. The undertaker determined that the cause of death was the deep cut to the throat, and the gunshots were just to ensure she was dead. The police searched the area around the body, and they didn't find the gun, the bullets, or the shells. Even though the police couldn't find the gun, they were pretty sure she was shot with a .38 caliber. A kitchen knife was found about 150 feet from the body, but the police weren't sure if it was the murder weapon. Mamie's body was still clothed, but she was missing one of her shoes and her hat. Her hat was found about 30 feet from her body, and the second shoe wasn't found. This led the police to believe that the murder was committed somewhere else, and then the body was dumped on the mountain. The police noted that the dye from Mamie's blue dress had bled into her undergarments. So the police suspected that her body had been on the mountain for at least part of the storm. The undertaker thought she had been dead no longer than 12 hours. Mamie was still wearing her $200 wedding ring, and her purse was with her as well. In her purse was $9. Based on these factors, the police decided that robbery wasn't the motive. Since Mamie had not been sexually assaulted, and robbery didn't appear to be the motive, the police concluded that Mamie's murder had been a crime of passion. The police immediately had two suspects, Mamie's landlord Harry Robertson and one of Harry's boarders, Clarence Stevenson. Clarence Stevenson was in his late 20s, and he was black. He did odd jobs for Harry around his property, and he also assisted Harry when he went fox hunting. The police searched the Robertsons' house, and they made several disturbing discoveries. It appeared that someone had tried to clean up a pool of blood that was on the basement floor. They also found bloody rags in the basement. The police also found a hole and a mark in the wall. They thought the hole was made by a bullet and the mark was made by a knife or a razor blade. In the Robertsons' car, the police found more blood. Also, the back seat had been removed and a tarp was laid down in the back of the vehicle. The police found out that Harry owned a hunting cabin, and it was located about 150 feet from where Mamie's body was found. Another boarder of the Robertsons, Oscar Townsend, was interviewed by the police. Townsend told them that recently, he and Harry had traded guns. He took Harry's .32 caliber gun, and Harry took his .38 caliber gun, which was the caliber of gun that was used to shoot Mamie. Supposedly, Harry kept the gun under his pillow. Townsend also told the police that Harry's wife Louise and Mamie used to be friends, but lately, there had been noticeable tension between the two. A few days after talking to Townsend, the police did another search of the Robertsons' house and their car, and they found more traces of blood that someone had tried to clean up. About a month after the murder, Harry Robertson and Clarence Stevenson were called to testify in front of the grand jury. On the stand, Harry admitted that for 2 years, he and Mamie had been having an affair. He testified that there was a private club in town called the Key Club. It was a speakeasy where the men in town could take their mistresses. He and Mamie met at the club often. Harry said that he used Stevenson to cover up the affair. He would tell Louise that he and Stevenson were going fox hunting, and then he would meet up with Mamie. Or he would tell Stevenson to get Louise to make them sandwiches that they could eat while they were hunting. Stevenson would also drive Mamie to meet Harry for their rendezvous. Harry then testified that he wasn't the only man that Mamie was having an affair with. She apparently spent her evenings at speakeasies while her husband was at work, and she would go home with different men. Harry said that Mamie gave him a list that had the names of 16 men that she had slept with. Of those 16 men, 15 of them lived in Logan, and 13 of them were married. There were also rumors that Mamie had been having an affair with Clarence Stevenson, but Harry said that he didn't think that anything was going on between them. Harry told the jury that even though he had been having an affair with Mamie, he was not involved in her murder. It was then Clarence Stevenson's turn to testify. He swore he was innocent. He said that the police had tried to intimidate him into confessing, but he had done nothing wrong, so he couldn't confess. The jury deliberated for 4 days, and then they returned with their decision. Clarence Stevenson was indicted for first-degree murder, and Harry Robertson was cleared of all charges. It's believed that the jury's decision stemmed from racism. Supposedly, several members of the jury were members of the Ku Klux Klan. It's also suspected that at least one of the members of the jury was one of Mamie's lovers. In October 1932, just 3 months after the murder, Clarence Stevenson went to trial. One of the witnesses that testified was Louise Robinson. She said she found out about the affair between Mamie and her husband on her own, and she despised Mamie. Several witnesses testified that they saw Stevenson driving the Robertsons' car on the morning that Mamie's body was found. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. They found Stevenson guilty of first-degree murder. He could have been sentenced to death, but the jury recommended mercy, so he was sentenced to life in prison. He ended up at the Hudsonville prison farm. In April 1942, he died in prison from stomach cancer. Supposedly, before he died, he told another inmate that he had just been paid to dump Mamie's body. He was asked who killed Mamie, and he refused to identify the killer. Instead, he said, "It's all politics." No one else has ever been charged in connection with Mamie's murder. Many people consider Harry and Louise Robertson the most likely suspects. Or the killer could have been one of Mamie's other lovers, or one of their wives. It's also possible that Mamie's husband Jack killed her after he found out about her repeated infidelities. But Jack swore he knew nothing about Mamie's affairs. He said he just assumed that she stayed home all night while he was at work. There is even a conspiracy theory that Mamie was involved in the town's bootlegging business and she was killed because of that, but no evidence has been found to back up that theory. 51 years after Mamie's murder, in 1983, her half-brother came to Logan looking for her grave. But the caretaker of the cemetery couldn't locate the grave. The caretaker looked in the records, and it said that an unnamed businessman paid $1,000 to have her body shipped to her hometown, Bradfordville, Kentucky. But there were no records of her being buried in Bradfordville. To this day, the location of Mamie Thurman's remains is a mystery. Some people believe that Mamie's spirit is restless because there are so many unresolved issues surrounding her murder. While driving on 22 Mine Road at night, people swore that they have heard mournful screams from a woman. Other people said they have seen a woman in a long coat leaning against a tree beside the road. Several coal miners said they were driving on the road and they saw a woman in old-fashioned clothes hitchhiking. They stop for her, she gets in the cab of the truck, and then she asks the driver to take her home. She gives them an address, and then she sits quietly in the passenger seat. But by the time the driver gets to the address, the woman passenger has disappeared. Several bus drivers who have driven on 22 Mine Road said that they have picked up a woman on the side of the road, and she is soaking wet. She tells the drivers her stop, and then she goes and sits down in a seat. When the bus arrives at her stop, the drivers look in the back of the bus, and the woman is gone. They would go to the back of the bus to make sure she wasn't lying down or hiding from their view in some way. They would get to the seat where she was sitting, and no one was there, but the seat was wet. Due to the alleged haunting of 22 Mine Road, the lack of resolution in the case, and the fact that a man was likely wrongly convicted for the crime, the murder of Mamie Thurman is one of West Virginia's most infamous crimes. Number 1. Herbert Baumeister. In the summer of 1994, Barry Wilson, a detective with the Indianapolis Police Department, was reviewing some missing persons reports, and she noticed something odd. 2 gay men, who were close in age, were reported missing within 6 weeks of each other. Alan Boussard was 28, and he was last seen leaving a gay bar on June 6, 1994. Roger Goodlett was 34, and he vanished after visiting a gay bar on July 22, 1994. Detective Wilson looked back further, and she realized that in the past year, 5 gay men had been reported missing from Indianapolis. Wilson decided to take a more in-depth look at the cases of the missing men. Shortly after she began her investigation, she was introduced to a man who was only identified by the pseudonym Tony Harris. Harris told Wilson about a strange encounter that he had. He said that one night in August, he was at a gay bar in downtown Indianapolis, and he noticed a man, who was in his 40s, looking at the missing persons poster for Roger Goodlett that was hung on the wall of the bar. Harris said that he and Goodlett were casual friends, and he had seen the man who was staring at the poster at other gay bars, but he had never met him before. Harris went over to the man, and he struck up a conversation with him. The man introduced himself as Brian. Harris said that after chatting for a while, Brian invited him back to his place for a swim. Harris agreed, and they got into Brian's pickup truck. Brian drove north, but Harris said that he didn't really pay attention to where they were going. They ended up at a mansion that had an indoor pool and a wet bar. Harris said that the area around the pool was cluttered with junk. Most notably, there were several mannequins that were arranged into strange poses. As they stood poolside, Harris said that Brian tried to convince him to get choked to the point of unconsciousness during sex. Brian then warned him that some people have been accidentally killed that way. But he said it made the sex so much better, so it was worth the risk. Harris said he refused, and he accused Brian of killing Roger Goodlett. Brian did not confirm or deny the allegation. Harris said that he decided to give Brian a taste of his own medicine. He wrapped his hands around Brian's throat and squeezed until Brian lost consciousness and fell into the pool. Seconds after going underwater, Brian popped back up. Harris thought that Brian would be angry, but he wasn't mad. Instead, he was excited because he had come close to dying. He told Harris that after he fell in the pool, Harris should have held him underwater. Despite the weirdness of the incident, Harris said that he ended up spending the night with Brian. The next morning, Brian drove him back to his car. Detective Wilson told Harris to call her if he ever saw Brian again. About a year later, on August 29, 1995, Harris came across Brian at a bar. Harris went out to the parking lot, he wrote down Brian's license plate, and then he called Detective Wilson. Wilson looked in the records and discovered that the pickup truck belonged to 49-year-old Herbert Baumeister. Wilson then began to investigate Herbert's background. He was born in April 1947 in Indiana to Dr. Herbert and Elizabeth Baumeister. He was the oldest of 4 children. Herbert had a relatively normal childhood, but classmates noticed that he liked to play with dead animals. During his teen years, his dad had him go for psychological testing. There aren't many records about the testing, but at least one doctor diagnosed him with schizophrenia. When Herbert was 18, he went to the University of Indiana, where he met Julie Sater. He dropped out after his first year, but he kept in contact with Julie. They got married in November 1971, when Herbert was 24. Herbert had problems holding down jobs because of his erratic behavior. But then in 1974, at the age of 26, he got a job with the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, and he managed to settle into the job. Julie gave birth to a daughter in 1979, a son in 1981, and a daughter in 1984. A year after his third child was born, Herbert was fired from his job at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles because of his odd behavior. 3 years later, Herbert opened a thrift store in Indianapolis called Save-A-Lot. The store was successful, and in 1990, he opened a second store in Indianapolis. In November 1991, Herbert, his wife, and their 3 children moved onto an estate in Westfield, Indiana, called Fox Hollow Farm. One of the unique features of the mansion was that it had an indoor pool. After Wilson discovered Brian's true identity, she approached Herbert while he was out shopping. She told him that she was investigating the disappearances of several men and he was a suspect. She said that she might be able to clear him as a suspect if he let her look around his property. Herbert told her that she could not come onto his property, and if she wished to talk to him again, then she should go through his lawyer. Wilson decided to approach the property's co-owner, Herbert's wife, Julie. Julie also denied Wilson access to the property. After Wilson confronted Herbert, Herbert told Julie that the police might be coming around, wanting to take a look around the property. He said it was over a baseless accusation of theft, and she shouldn't let them onto the property. When Wilson asked Julie to look on the property, Wilson told her that it was regarding the disappearance of several men. Wilson said that Julie was visibly shocked when she learned this. Nevertheless, she didn't let Wilson search the property. But the thought that her husband was a possible serial killer haunted Julie. Their marriage had been unconventional. In the 24 years that they had been married, they only had sex 6 times. Also, she had never seen Herbert naked. Around the time the men started disappearing, Julie and the kids were spending more time out of town, visiting friends and family. Herbert didn't join them on these trips. Instead, he stayed home alone. Even when Julie was home, the couple didn't sleep together. Instead, Herbert slept in a different room, on a pull-out couch. Besides their marital problems, something odd that happened the year before Detective Wilson approached her stuck out in her mind. Her and Herbert's son had been playing in a wooded area in the backyard, and he found a complete human skeleton. Herbert said the skeleton was an anatomical display model that was owned by his father, who was a doctor. At the time, Julie had believed him. Shortly before the skeleton was found, business at the thrift stores had taken a dive, and they were having a hard time paying their bills. During this time, Herbert would disappear for hours at a time when he was supposed to be working at one of the thrift stores. When he would return to work, he reeked of booze, and he would be belligerent to the staff. 3 months after Detective Wilson approached Julie, she filed for divorce. 2 months later, Herbert closed both of his stores. On June 23, 1996, not long after the stores were shut down, Julie allowed the police to search their property. It wasn't long before the police unearthed some human remains. Initially, they thought they found the remains of 9 men, but DNA testing revealed that they had found 11 bodies. 8 of the men, including Alan Broussard and Roger Goodlett, were identified. At the time of this video, the other 3 victims have not been identified. Herbert found out that the police were searching his property, and he fled. On July 3, 1996, 11 days after the police searched his property, Herbert was found in the Pinery Provincial Park in southwestern Ontario, Canada. He had shot himself in the forehead. He left a suicide note, but he made no reference to the murders in his note. Instead, he wrote that he killed himself because of his business failures and because his marriage was ending. 2 years after the discovery of the bodies and Herbert's suicide, the police made a shocking announcement. They said that they firmly believe that Herbert Baumeister was responsible for another set of serial murders. Before Herbert was identified, the killer was called the I-70 Strangler. The first victim of the I-70 Strangler was 17-year-old Eric Roger. Eric lived in Indianapolis, and he was last seen alive by his sister on May 7, 1985. She said that he ate a peanut butter sandwich and then left their home to go out for the evening. His body was found a few weeks later beside an isolated road in Ohio. He had been strangled to death. In his stomach was a half-digested peanut butter sandwich, so the police think that he was killed on the same night that he left his family's home. Eric was killed not long after Herbert Baumeister was fired from his job at the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. In the 5 years after Eric's murder, the bodies of 8 more men were dumped near Interstate 70 in Ohio. All the men lived in and around Indianapolis. They had all been strangled to death, and their bodies were all dumped near water. Finally, the identified victims were all gay. The I-70 Strangler murders ended just as business was taking off for Herbert's thrift store. As the store became more successful, the family moved to Fox Hollow Farm. It's believed that about 18 months after the family moved onto the estate, Herbert started bringing home young men when his family was out of town. Herbert Baumeister is believed to be the I-70 Strangler because the victims that were found buried in his backyard are very similar to the Strangler's victims. They were white gay men, all around the same age, who lived in and around Indianapolis. All the victims died the same way. They were strangled to death. And finally, after Herbert was exposed as a serial killer, a friend of a victim of the I-70 Strangler said that Herbert was the man he saw his friend leave the bar with on the last night that he was seen alive. The police think it's highly possible that Herbert killed more than the 20 men he's credited with murdering. But unfortunately, we may never know the true extent of damage caused by Herbert Baumeister. Julie eventually put Fox Hollow Farm up for sale with an asking price of $2.3 million. It eventually sold for less than a third of the asking price. The current owners of the home said that they have noticed strange things happening around the property. For example, they have seen dark shadows in the wooded area where the bodies were buried. Several people said that they have seen a young man in a red shirt who disappears into the trees. Other times, doors slam even though no one is around. People have also said that while they were alone on the property, they were poked or pushed. Because of the owner's claims of strange happenings, Fox Hollow Farm has been featured on several television shows that cover supposed hauntings. In 2015, the family who owns Fox Hollow Farm allowed a travel company that specializes in touring haunted houses to bring tourists to the property where 11 men were killed and buried. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. But that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching.